Hey everybody, it's Chief Meteorologist Brad Panovich here. Thanks for joining us for our winter forecast question and answer session. We did the forecast last night at 11, so if you missed it, it is on our WCNC website as well as our Weather IQ YouTube channel, which we really want you to go subscribe to because you'll see updates like this all the time. I'm going to go over the forecast, and as we go along, we're going to get some questions in from our live stream, and we'll try to answer some of those. But let me go over some of the details from last night. In case you missed it, the big story for this upcoming winter, once again, is La Niña. Now, La Niña, a lot of folks know what El Nino is. You've heard of that. That's when we have warmer water in the equatorial Pacific. This year is kind of unique. This is what we call a double dip La Niña. It's the second year in a row with La Niña in effect. And it looks like this year, actually, the La Niña could be moderate to strong. Last year was kind of a weak, I'm almost call it a neutral phase, which we jokingly call La Nada, which is in between. But what happens when the water is cooler than average here, it really plays with our jet stream in the winter months. And it's just not winter. The cool season is impacted the fall, the winter, and the spring. It doesn't really impact our summers as much except for hurricane season. But typically, this is on average. If you take all the La Niñas in the past, this is typically what we see. We see warmer and drier than normal winters. Now, that's not always the case. There are some outliers, but I would say 70 to 80% of the time, you're going to end up with warm and dry conditions. The biggest difference in some of these years that we've seen over time is that sometimes we get some unique patterns which can cause some cold and snow. Now, I love this map because this is a map from Brian Bretzheimer. He's up in Alaska. And what this map shows is when we have a moderate La Niña in place, what are the temperatures like during the winter time? So I'm going to zoom in on the Carolinas because you see a lot of orange and red. You may not see it really well at home, but I'll show you real quickly here. The reds and the oranges are anywhere from 1 to 2.7 degrees above average Fahrenheit. And notice how the whole southeastern part of the country is above average. So that would really kind of hint at the fact that we're probably going to see above average temperatures. And I think that's the highest confidence I have in our forecast this upcoming winter. This is a trend we've seen really since about 2010, 2014 were probably two of the last winters or so that we had some colder than average temperatures. And you can see all that orange and red. And notice how the whole Ohio Valley down to the south is above average. If you want colder weather in a La Niña, it's typically the Dakotas and the front range of the Rockies from Wyoming up into parts of Montana. Usually Canada, the Pacific Northwest, and even parts of Alaska have really cold, snowy winters in the setup, but not so much here in the Carolinas. Now, I mentioned there were some caveats or some outliers. Let me show you some of those outliers. Actually, Chris Mulcahy and I worked in this last year, pulling up some of the recent La Niña winters. Last year was one of them. We had way below 0.3. But in 2017-18, not that this was way above average, but we had 4 inches of snow. Our new average snowfall here in the Charlotte area is about 3.5, so that was technically above average. But the big outlier here to me is this 2010-2011 winter. And I remember that specifically because we had a lot of blocking here in the eastern part of the country, which I'll explain in a minute. And we had really cold and snowy weather. We had 6.1 inches of snow. Even back then, the average was 4.3. That was way above. So there are a couple winters when you look at recent La Niña patterns where we actually ended up with slightly above average snowfall. And the thing about snowfall around here that's kind of unique is that it only takes 1 or 2 storms to really give you above average snowfall. When you think about the fact that our average snowfall is down to 3.5 inches of snow, it doesn't take a whole lot to get above average. But let's look at those averages. What is typical for the Charlotte area? You might be new to the area. And one of the things about our area that's kind of unique, we don't get a ton of snow, but in 143 years of record keeping, we've never had a winter with 0. And I know a lot of folks will say right away, oh, Brad, well, I remember this winter, I didn't see snow. Just because you didn't see it doesn't mean it fell. A lot of times snow falls, sticks for a while and melts. It falls in the middle of the night. It falls when you're out of town or somewhere else and you don't see it. It still counts as snowfall. But many folks want to see a big white blanket, and that doesn't happen every winter like the picture in the background. So our all-time average, 143 years, that's taking every single year's worth of snowfall and averaging it out over 143 years, 5.5 inches. But in the last 30-year average, which goes from 1991 to 2020, it's only 3.5. And then the last 10 years, we've only averaged 2.6 inches. So there's clearly a downward trend. Just based on trends alone, you would probably think below average is a pretty good bet. But if you look at El Nino, La Nina, and neutral years, just those years, La Nina, we get the least amount of snow in that setup. El Nino, 5.4, and La Nada, which is the neutral phase, is actually the best setup for snow here. We've averaged 5.9 inches of snow in those neutral phase years. So if you're a snow lover, you want to hear me say neutral phase or El Nino. When you hear La Nina, that usually does not spell good news for the Carolinas. So what are some of the things or parameters we look at? Well, people ask me all the time, the El Nino La Nina phase is by far the biggest thing we look at. It's the hugest driver or the biggest driver of our winter weather. One unique thing, we look at snowfall over in Siberia in October. There is a correlation between above average snowfall in Siberia in October and cold, snowy winters on the East Coast. Last couple years, it hasn't really worked out, but we do look at that. Arctic sea ice, and I'll talk more about this. This is where the climate change thing comes in a little bit. When we have a ton of Arctic sea ice, a lot of cold air can build up in Canada, and you have a big reservoir. When you don't, there's not a lot of cold air up there. But sometimes, because there's not a lot of cold air up there, the cold air that is there gets displaced south. I'll talk more about that. And then obviously, just the warming climate and warm sea surface temperatures tend to drive everything kind of bonkers. So if you look at all these parameters, and if I put them all together, if I were to add them up, the forecast would be warm and dry. So those are the parameters we're looking at. But as I mentioned, there's some little caveats to this I need to talk about. And that one of those is that sea ice thing. So let's look at the sea ice. And I'll show you sea ice here. I'm going to forward to this real quickly. So this is the Arctic sea ice as of November 1st. Typically, the yellow line is where we would see the normal location of Arctic sea ice. There's a big lag in that right now. There's not a ton of sea ice up there. And one thing about the Arctic, unlike the Antarctic, in the Arctic, there's not much land. It's an ocean. So it's all sea ice. It's basically ice on top of the water. And when it melts, it causes the water to be exposed, which then absorbs more sunlight and causes it to get warmer. It's one of those feedback loops that we don't like to see up there. And if we look at a chart of the sea ice, this is a really telling story. Last year, or 2012, is the record lowest sea ice. That's the dotted line. This year is the blue line. So while it's not record lows, it's very close, and it's certainly well below the long-term average. So why is this important? Right away you think, okay, that means less cold and snow. But what it does to the jet stream is fairly interesting. And this thing is something we've seen over the last couple of years. In a typical year, the jet stream goes up and down. It meanders north and south, and this really influences basically the amount of snow and cold we see. That's a typical winter. But when there's less sea ice up in the Arctic, it causes the jet stream to get really kind of wild. And what I mean by that is we see these giant ridges and these giant troughs of low pressure. And we sometimes refer to this as blocking. When these big ridges build over the eastern part of Canada up into Greenland and the North Atlantic, we call that the NAO, the North Atlantic Oscillation. We see big blocking patterns, and that can drive really cold air into the eastern half of the country. This is what we saw back in the La Nina in 2010 and 11. This can end up giving you some really big cold snaps. But here's the flip side of this. Like we saw last year with the La Nina, if this whole thing shifts to the west a little bit, that puts the Carolinas in that big warm-up, and we get blowtorched. And cold air is to our west. And you may remember this happening last year because remember Texas and Louisiana and parts of Oklahoma were in the deep freeze for about 2 weeks. That's because one of these big dips drove way down into Texas, but it didn't affect us here on the East Coast. We were actually above average warm temperatures. So this is the kind of thing you watch. And where that little dip sets up and where that big ridge sets up can be kind of tough. We don't really see that until about 2 weeks out. And that can make for some very interesting forecasts. So let's take a look at the forecast based on all of these things I've been looking at across the Carolinas. I expect above average temperatures. This is the highest confidence part of my forecast. I really think we're going to see above average temperatures, even though the averages for our winter have gone up recently. We're now about 2 degrees warmer in this last 30-year time frame than we were the previous 30 years in the winter. So we went from like an average of around 42 degrees for the 3 winter months to about 44 degrees. It's a pretty significant change, but I still think we'll be above average. Now, snowfall-wise, I still think we're going to be below average, but I said this last night, the one area that I'm a little bit more kind of wishy-washy on would be the mountains, because there's such an active storm track in La Nina winters across the Ohio Valley. Sometimes even those cold fronts and those storm tracks can get close to the mountains and have just enough cold air and elevation to give them some snow and ice, while here in the Piedmont and areas east, we see a whole lot less of that. You can see I expect below average. So if we look at those snowfall totals, and I showed this last night, this was kind of like my bold prediction here. I did this a couple times in the past, but I wanted to do this year just to kind of give you an idea on just a ballpark number. Now, these will not be right because it's impossible to specifically forecast the amount of snow. So this really is just for fun. The 30-year average in the Boone area is down about 10 inches in the last 10 years. So the average now is about 25.5, even though they had some snow today. I don't think it was measurable. I think it ended up being a trace. I expect about 22.6 inches of snow up there. And that would include any snow that falls in the autumn. Now, Hickory, your snowfall average is down about 1.5 inches from the previous 30-year period. It's about 6.9. I think we're going to get closer to about 5.8. And again, is it going to be exactly 5.8? Absolutely not. I'm just giving you kind of a ballpark. And for the Charlotte area, our 30-year average is 3.5. And just to give you some perspective, the last 2 winters, 0.3, not 3, 0.3 inches of snow and 0.3 inches of snow for 2 years in a row. So I'm going with 2.5. So I'm actually going higher than the past 2 winters, but still below average. So that's kind of what I'm thinking for the snowfall forecast here in the area. So let's take a look at some of the questions. I kind of been seeing the comments come through here, so I'll kind of look over. Someone asked about snow totals at my house. So that, it's funny, I get a lot of questions about snow totals. And one of the cool things about snow is that everyone loves it, but it's also incredibly difficult as a meteorologist to forecast, not only because of the parameters that go into it, but because of that at your house part of it. If it rains like it did today, unless you have a rain gauge, I'd say 99% of you have no idea how much rain actually fell today. You just know, did it rain or did it not rain? But with snow, you don't need any fancy equipment. Everyone can go out in their yard and see exactly how much snow fell. So from verification standpoint, snow is the one weather parameter that everyone can verify whether you got it right or wrong to the nearest 1/10 of an inch, just because it's so easy to measure. Rainfall is more of a binary thing. Did it rain or did it not rain? So snowfall totals in your yard are always difficult because you're trying to forecast for a general area. And in your backyard, it might be different than a couple of houses down. So that's one of the reasons we get. So what's one of our questions? Is global warming causing the change in reduction? I certainly think it is. There's no way to dispute the trends. And I'm going to show you an interesting graphic. This is the temperatures for Charlotte since 1970 in the winter only. Okay, I put a regression line, which is that line in the middle. So basically, since 1970, and if you were here in the 70s and 80s, that's the golden era of snow and cold in the Carolinas. It was great back then. You probably grew up with snow every winter. But since then, the temperature has gotten progressively warmer every single year. And you can go back to 1878 and the warming is still there. It's more pronounced, though, in probably the last 50 years. And if we look at the snowfall totals in the same time period, these are the snowfall totals since we started keeping records in the 1800s. Look at the regression line or the trend. It's all down. So we got way bigger snowfall in the past. And yes, there are some years in the last 20 or 30 years. I remember 2004, 2003, those huge spikes, but those are become rarer and rarer. You look in the past, there's a lot more of these upper spikes. Sure, it bounced around, but there was pretty steady, some big snows. Recently, those big spikes are fewer and farther between. So we're clearly getting less snow and it's getting warmer. So I think regardless of what anyone thinks the cause is, there is a warming and less snow trend in the Carolinas. It's just, the data just speaks for itself. And as you can't blame this on urban heat islands either, because it's the snow coming out of a cloud. The cloud is not impacted by what's happening down here at the surface. Doesn't mean it couldn't melt on the way down, but this is clearly a warming trend in our climate that is going on. Next question. How often, you mentioned that our snow could easily be over by one event. Okay, this has been modeled to show often La Niña, El Niño can produce multiple snow events versus being skewed by 1 or 2 storms. So it's not really anything to do with modeling. This basically just has to do with the fact that our average snowfall is getting lower. So the chance of getting one storm to overachieve that is much easier. An average snow event around here is about 1 to 2 inches, maybe an inch. So typically that would be about 3 events to get to our average snow. Well, now that we're down to about 3.5 inches, it's about half as many events. So it takes less events to get to our average snow than it did just 10 years ago. So it really has just more to do with the fact that this trend downward has created a bigger opportunity for a big snow event. When is the next El Nino? Well, we don't know because usually these are seasonal forecasts for El Nino, La Nina come out maybe 3 to 6 to 9 months ahead of time. So we really wouldn't know if there's going to be an El Nino probably till the spring or next summer. That's when we would get the first hints of what it's going to look like going into the winter time. I think that would be our first hint of that. And probably what's going to happen, more likely than not, we got to get back to the neutral or even phase even before we go back to El Nino. So we would see that slow change happening. Next question. Are we going to get more ice here on Lake Lookout than snow? We usually never get much snow. Please don't bust this forecast. The interesting thing about ice, and this is the one thing, and I didn't really mention this a lot last night. One interesting thing about La Nina winters is because there's not a ton of cold air, deep cold air coming from Canada where we get persistent cold, we tend to get more shallow cold air masses when they do get down here. And if you know anything about shallow cold air, what I mean by shallow, the cold air is hugging the ground. It can be warmer aloft. Ice events are always a concern in this because if we do get cold air, it's likely going to be shallow and we could see an icing event. And really, people say we're overdue for snow. I think we're overdue for ice around here. It has been a long time since we've had a significant ice storm. And this used to be the ice storm capital of America because we had so much cold air damming trapped up against the mountain. So that's a really good question. Do you anticipate any late season frost? Well, here's the thing about late season frost. One of the things that we've seen recently is we haven't really seen late season frost. The problem is that it's gotten warm so early that the growing season has started sooner. So what happens is the last couple of years, we've seen it warm up in February and early March, and we always get a frost at the end of March or early April. The thing in the past was the growing season hadn't started by then. So those frosts weren't as deadly. Some of the peach crop gets going in late February, March, and we get that typical freeze or frost in late March or early April. Then it starts to threaten the crop. So what you really got to watch out for is how warm the winter is. Does that kickstart the growing season too soon and doesn't give us time to get to that first frost or freeze? So right now, it's hard to say how late in the season, but it seems like every year we're going to get a frost or freeze sometime late March, early April. It's just a matter of how quickly the growing season starts. Haven't had a good snow in a while. None of us have, honestly. I would say the last decent snow, where it was actually you could make snowballs and snowmen and have fun out there, was probably 2019. We had a good maybe inch and a half storm, but it's been a while. You know, the last 2 years have not been great. You really got to go back to 16, 17 winter where there was decent snow. And here's the other thing. It's hard to get a widespread snow for everybody. We will get good snow in mountains or the foothills or sometimes even the Piedmont. The most widespread snow we've had probably got to go back to 2010, which was that Christmas, the White Christmas, which was the first one since the 50s. That actually ended up dumping snow on the entire state of North Carolina between the 25th and 26th of December. Another question here. Miller A events. Okay, this is a great question. So Miller A events, which could help pull down colder air and give us a shot of bigger winter storms. So Miller A and Miller B are the type of low pressure systems that form in the wintertime, whether it's more coastal dominant or whether we have an inland low pressure system. So it's a meteorological jargon for the type of system. And Miller A tends to bring down some colder air. It tends to pull down and wrap in some colder air. But the thing about the Miller A, Miller B setup, the storm track just is never really that favorable in La Nina winters. The best storm track for us, and let's see if I can put a map up here. I'll go back to our La Nina map. You know, the jet stream up here is not great for us. We want the jet stream to be down here, at least the Pacific or the subtropical jet, to be coming across the Gulf Coast. And we want the polar jet to be dropping cold air down. So one of the things that we'd like to see, like the ideal storm track for snow lovers, is to have the polar jet stream down here in the south, have the cold air already in place, and then get a strong storm system to form down here. What often happens here in the winter that's not very favorable is the cold air is chasing the moisture, or the moisture comes in when the cold air escapes. We need the cold air first. That's usually the way it works around here. Get a big Arctic front, cold air gets in here, and then the follow-on storm behind the Arctic front is the one that gives us snow. If the front and the storm are arriving at the same time, that really never works out. And that's what we mean by cold air chasing the rain, because if the cold air is coming with the storm, sometimes the cold air pushes the moisture out and chases it out before we have a chance to get snow. So great question. Next one. How do you feel about precipitation as a whole? Dry, wet, or above normal? That's a great question. The drought monitor came out today, and it was not great. We are now in moderate drought for most of the Piedmont, including the Charlotte area. And unfortunately, La Nina winters tend to be dry. The only difference was last year was La Nina, and it was kind of wet, even though it was warm. So last year was kind of like a split decision, if you will, on La Nina. But this year, just based on the way the autumn has kind of progressed with the drought, I think drought is going to be an issue that we might have to deal with for this winter. So I'm looking at probably below average rainfall for this upcoming winter. But that's a great question because around here, a day like today where it's 40 degrees and raining, that's kind of a typical winter storm for us. We usually get a lot of those. We may not get as much rainfall in these cold setups like we're seeing right now. So great question there from Daniel. Here's the next question. How many times this winter will you see 4 seasons in a day? That, I'd say not 4 seasons, probably 3 seasons more likely. Late winter is always that time of year, February, March, where we can see those wild swings. And one of the things about La Nina patterns that is something to keep an eye on, typically severe weather late in the winter and early spring is an issue with La Nina. Some of the biggest tornado outbreaks, especially here in the Tennessee and Ohio valleys, have been in La Nina winters, and those have happened in February and March. So something to keep an eye on late in the season as we're trying to transition back to spring. We tend to see La Nina winters end with severe weather, even in the winter months. So I'm talking February, March. You think about the Super Tuesday outbreak. I believe that was in 2006. The super outbreak, which was on Super Tuesday for the primaries, that actually occurred in a La Nina winter. So you tend to see some of those big outbreaks late in the winter when we have La Nina in place. So that would be something to keep an eye on late in the season. But if you're looking for 4 seasons in one day, that happens. Good question. When are we getting an additional radar? Well, I'd love to tell you a specific time, but it's going in the right direction. There is legislation right now in the state of North Carolina for a feasibility study that NC State is going to do to hopefully look at this by May of next year. We should have that feasibility study, and next year the funding part of this should go through, and maybe late next year or the year after we could get radars. One of the things about radars, even if all this got approved, just like everything else, the order and the parts and the radars are way behind schedule. So I think it would be difficult to get those in place until maybe 2023. Next question. So we're looking at a warm winter, like 40s and 50s. Is that hoodie weather? Actually, 40s and 50s for highs would be normal. When we have cold winters, our highs are actually in the 30s and 40s. So you would actually be below the average high in the middle of the winter. The coldest part of the winter is 50 degrees. So 40s to near 50 is normal. So mild would be mid and upper 50s and probably a lot more 60s than we're used to. The thing about averages, remember, it's the average throughout the season, and averages are made up of extremes. The thing is, we'll have more extreme warm weather than more extreme cold weather. The highs will rule and the lows will kind of get canceled out. That's kind of the way it works. But that's a good question. Does La Nina ever end during the winter? Great question. It can wind down early, but in this situation, the La Nina is building right now. It's actually not fully in effect and probably won't be until midwinter. So if we saw it trending the other way, we would probably be forecasting a neutral winter or maybe a weak La Nina. But because it's strengthening, we actually expect it to get worse as the winter goes on. So and this is forecast driven, anything could change. But there has been times in the past where we've seen that happening ahead of time, but we would know about it by now if it was going to be weakening. So that's a great question though. Next one. I lived in Columbia in 2010 when we saw the February 13th storm that dumped 8.6 inches. Did Charlotte or NC or North Carolina get any snow? I said, yes. That was a really cold winter. 2010 was incredible. And you probably saw it on my chart here. I'll go back to it. That was a La Nina winter, 2010 and 11, which would have been December through 2011. So, but the winter before was pretty good as well. We had 6.1 inches of snow in that winter. But the thing about the 2010 the 2011 winter was the White Christmas year. That was that incredible White Christmas that happened in 2010. So that was the first White Christmas since 1954. So yeah, that was a pretty good couple of years there. And that was really the last time we had some consistent cold. and snow. And we've seen some crazy storms like that where we've seen snow to our south and not here. There was a couple of those that affected even Charleston and Columbia, but the moisture was so far south, we didn't get much snow up here in the Charlotte area. But that did impact parts of the Carolinas. Columbia gets even less snow than we do here in the Charlotte area. So the fact that you got a good one was great. Next question here. So up near Boone, it will be a pretty normal winter, a couple storms, mainly rain and gross. How cold are you thinking? So in Boone, the average temperature in the winter, and that's taking the highs and lows, is typically around 33, 34 degrees. So an above average temperature up there for this winter, even in the mid to upper 30s, is still kind of cold. But I do expect a lot more rain events than snow. But remember, even in the Boone area, your averages have gone down, but you still average about 26 inches of snow per winter. So I would anticipate at least getting some of that. The thing about the Boone area is that some of the biggest storms up there come from cold fronts with northwest flow, but also coastal storms that throw snow back inland. So hopefully we'll get some of those for the mountains, because the ski resorts would love to see some of that snow this upcoming winter. And that's the thing about the ski resorts. They can take advantage of the cold air even when there's not moisture because of the amazing snowmaking equipment they have. So last ski season was one of the best ski seasons on record because the cold air timed out perfectly with a lot of holidays and weekends. We didn't get a lot of natural snow, but because of the man-made abilities and the cold air timing out perfectly, it was one of the most successful seasons they've ever had here in the North Carolina mountains. Next question. The woolly worm and persimmons say snow. I'll believe the wildlife. Here's the thing about the wildlife. There's been a lot of research on all those. The thing is, they've forecasted cold and snowy winters for the last several winters, and we haven't had them. So take that for what it's worth. I mean, the thing about especially persimmon seeds and acorns and other things like that that happen during the summer, that's more driven by rainfall that happens during the summer months and how plants are growing in that time of the year. Doesn't really tell you a lot about the winter. Sometimes in the past, that would be a proxy for a wet year overall. And if it was a cold winter, then you would assume, okay, that means it's going to be a snowy winter. The problem is we've had plenty of moisture in the past. We just don't have the cold air anymore. So a wet winter doesn't always mean snow. It just means a lot of rain, more so than snow. If you don't have the cold air, that's the thing about snow. You need cold air and snow, or a cold air and moisture. If you get all the moisture and no cold air, it's just rain, or like I like to say, underdeveloped snow. But that's a good question. Hickory here, we always seem to be on the dividing line. Why? Well, it's all elevation and cold air damming. So one of the things about North Carolina, and I'm going to bring up a current map since we're talking about today, because today's a good example. We actually have cold air damming in place. So this is a look at the map today. We've got northeast winds pushing cool air against the mountains and this moisture overriding it. So in a situation like that, if you go up towards Hickory, the elevation in Charlotte's around 700 feet. As you get closer to Hickory, you're getting closer to 1,000 feet. And that's a big difference in temperature. If the freezing level's at 2,000 or 3,000 feet, then that can allow for some of that moisture to make it to the ground before melting. And that even happens in the city. Sometimes the top of the buildings, it's snowing in uptown and it's raining at street level. So elevation is everything. It's also because you're a little farther north in Hickory, so you're deeper in the cold air. The cold air is coming in from the north. And as you go north, you're getting deeper cold air, which means it's got a much bigger depth. And then elevation, always your friend. That's why the mountains see more snow. If you can get up closer to where the clouds are, you're going to get a better chance of seeing some snow. All right, so even though it's a warmer winter, are we still good? Probably 1 or 2 snow events. That's a great question. I would say yes, and that's the thing about it. And I will leave everyone with this because I think that's a really important part. Just because it's a warm winter doesn't mean we're not going to see snow. Like I said, we've seen snow every winter on record. The thing is, you can have a warm winter and still get snow because you can get warm temperatures for 3 weeks out of the month and cold and snowy for 1 week. That month is still warm, even though you got snow for 1 week. So that could happen in this winter. We could end up with 1 or 2 good storms, and then in between those, it's all warm and no snow. So that's how you can end up with above average snowfall and warm winters. And in fact, we've had some of those recently where we've had warm winters, but we've ended up with above average snow. And in El Nino years, those are some of the El Nino years that we've had where it's been warm and wet for a lot of winter, but the cold air came down just in time. We got a bunch of snow, then it was warm and wet, and then we got another cold blast. So we're going to get cold fronts. It's not like it's not going to be cold at some point, but much like we're seeing this week, the cold snap happening today, right now, we can get 4 or 5 days like this where it's cold. And then next week when it's in the 70s, people will forget about the cold that happened this week. But that's kind of the way the winter season goes. So if you like snow, like I do, I love snow. I mean, honestly, it's one of the first things I grew up loving about weather was a good snowstorm. There's still a chance for snow. It's just the overall opportunities are diminished. I heard my friend Tim Buckley up in Greensboro put it very, very succinctly. He said, it's like having a bunch of at-bats. We're going to have less at-bats in this game for snow, but it doesn't mean the few that we have, we can't hit a home run. So we can still have that happen. It's just our opportunities are diminished, and we're probably just going to have 1 or 2 chances to do that. So that's why I still think probably more in that 2.5, 2.8 inch snow totals look to be possible. Hopefully it's snow and not ice, because to me, ice is the worst. So I'm going to do one more question. We're going to wrap it up. Oh, a good question for the Piedmont Triangle area. So I would say very similar. Most of the Carolinas east of the mountains probably looking at warm and below average snowfall. But I do think the farther north and west you go. So if we have anybody watching from the mountains, West Virginia, Virginia, up into Kentucky, Ohio, one of the things about La Niña, and I'll show the map again because I think this is really important. It's not particularly cold up in this area, but it's wet. That's usually a pretty active storm track. So that storm track sometimes can give big storms just to the northwest of the Carolinas. So I'm talking about eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio, eastern Tennessee, even southwestern Virginia. Sometimes in this setup can get the cold air and the moisture. So that's an area to watch. That's why this is kind of always the wild card region in La Niña winters. We know it's typically cold there, warm here, but with the active storm track, if you can sneak some of this cold air down here, this area of the country can be very active. So I know there was a bunch of questions, and thanks everybody for kind of tuning in. If you have any more questions, just keep putting them into our YouTube channel. Make sure you go to our Weather IQ YouTube channel. You can make some comments there. I'll try to go back through those tonight and maybe try to answer some of those. And as always, you guys can always hit me up on social media as well throughout the season. Because remember, this is a seasonal forecast. I do this for fun. Out of the 18 years I've done this, I've gotten 14 right and 4 completely wrong. So there's a good chance I'm going to blow this at some point. I mean, I do better than I actually thought. And some of these events we don't really know about until the day of. Seasonal forecasting is about, could it be a little bit above or below? But when it comes to weather, day-to-day weather, you really got to wait like 7 to 10 days out to really have a good idea. And who knows, there could be some period between now and March where for a 2-week period, the cold and the moisture line up, and that could be our best opportunities of the winter. So I'm always going to think snow because I love it, and I hope we get a little bit of it. But this winter, overall, I think it's going to end up being warm and dry. Thanks for joining us today, guys, and I will see you on TV today at 4, 5, and 6 on WCNC Charlotte.